Even after I was no longer employed by the state government in Melbourne, several ethnic families remained friends with me. Some even thought that I was still working there, and the Turks in particular were expecting me to assist them with their needs, interpreting English into their language. Amongst them, one middle-aged Turkish lady hated Armenians as she believed the stories historically told, which I have mentioned earlier. Her daughter Susan was separated from her aging husband, whom she was forced to marry by a traditional arrangement in Turkey. However, she was in love with another Turk, who preferred to change his identity and name to George. He was a tailor by trade, and the name he chose appealed to him. He spoke about his life being in danger for being involved with Susan, according to some Muslim traditions. In other words, he would be shot and killed. Efil, Susan's mother, was extremely unhappy about other people suspecting that I was allegedly an Armenian dog. She exclaimed that she would pluck out the eyes of any Armenian dog. I could not understand the motive behind this attitude, and was uninterested in knowing anything about it. When I met Susan and George, they told me all about their desire to settle in Western Australia and asked if I could help them. He had recently purchased a Mazda fitted with a rotary motor and said I could be their navigator. It was a good idea, that is, if we could share the expenses, and it could make journeying a long distance fun. After the final arrangements, very early one morning we set out for Western Australia. I became their guide. First, we headed towards Adelaide, under my direction, and spent some time there before travelling along the Nullarbor. When we had a minor problem with the fuel and stopped somewhere shortly after we emerged from the City of Cathedrals, we encountered a big-built biker from New Zealand who asked where we were going and obtained some diesel for us from one of the truckies. That was indeed a very nice surprise. Susan and George were stunned by this adventure towards Perth. However, it was ironic that a number of people were still discriminating against me. I was accepted as one of them by people in some parts of the world, whereas in others I was completely opposed to by a fierce, judgmental attitude. Indeed, I have traveled to almost every part of the world. In Peru, I was at first considered as a gringo, or an American, until I conversed with them, and a few elected to think of me as possibly Spanish, but I spoke with them in their native tongue, although imperfectly. I visited Peru many times, long after my marriage was no more. In the Philippines, some thought of me as being Spanish, Greek, or French. Nobody ever spoke of me being Armenian or Persian. In Germany, I was fiercely opposed to as being definitely Middle Eastern, a Turk of Muslim heritage, even by their government officers, which wrote down my identity without even having the common courtesy to ask me what background I was from. They recorded my origins as Turkish and Islam, supposedly making it easier for me, so that I did not struggle to figure out how correctly I should answer them about my true identity in their language. Was it not interesting and noble of them to write down my answers about who I was, my beliefs, or background before I could even answer them? Some of them told me that there was no difference between an Armenian and Turk, that both were just the same. It was extremely unusual for those well-cultured Germans to know so much about people they encountered, and yet surely they were completely void of any knowledge of history and geography. Hearing something like that would most certainly infuriate Turks. However, when in Turkey, most of my associates claimed that I looked very much like a Jew or an Armenian, even European or French Armenian, by simply observing my distinct facial features. Anywhere in China, India, or Southeastern Asia, I was considered as being of a European background. In some parts of India, I was more Persian. In parts of the Philippines, I was from a background of foreign invaders or a holy man. In Indonesia, and particularly in Bali, I was generally thought of being from Iran, Iraq, and of Muslim background, wherein in Egypt I was either Alexandrian or of Indian descent. Polish, Russian, and people of former Yugoslavia, as well as Hungarians, thought of me as being either Russian Armenian or Gypsy. In truth, in communist bloc countries, I was more accepted and respected for being who I was than in Germany. In Britain, I experienced some opposition, as a number of people thought of me as a Jew, an Indian, or an Afghan. But many in London considered not only my looks, but by listening to my accent that I was most certainly French. In Germany, many preferred to stick to their guns, forever opposing me discriminately and naming me anew a dirty Turk, a Muslim terrorist, and a foreign bastard. They even sent a note to my then-wife shortly after our wedding to warn her about the possible consequences of marrying a Middle Eastern person of Islamic background. I know I have referred to this before. I had a soupçon of fear that such a note directed to her from a government authority would have a devastating effect on her unconscious mind years later. But if she truly loved me, it should have no influence. In Russia, France, and Spain, I was just one of them, and the Italians never questioned me, for I lived and spoke just like them. However, in Australia, I literally had to force myself to be understood as to who or what I was, and not as they were guessing. Many Europeans living in Melbourne and Sydney considered me as one of them. Germans were still cautious with me, considering my identity being Jewish. I felt more at home with the French and Italians. Australian natives, bless them, accepted me as one of their white brothers, perhaps after discovering my willingness to get to know all about their culture. However, even in those countries where I was generally looked down on, as if belonging to a lower grade or subhuman culture, I aimed to make great friends. I would always smile with them and share their stories. After gaining their attention and interest upon their discovery of my intellectual and academic studies, with an unwavering desire to speak their language and understand their traditions, they accepted and appreciated my presence. Many were keen to get to know me better after discovering my background being mostly European, although some were still very cautious. The old stigma was still alive. According to thorough research, I am a surprising mixture. According to my DNA analysis, I am of mostly European, particularly French, partially Indian, and Armenian origin. During the past few centuries, there were many migrations between France and Russian Armenia, and some of my ancestors have fallen in love, settled in Europe, and married there. Others preferred to return to Armenia for wealthy businesses they conducted in the shipping industry, oil trade, and farming, until the 1915 atrocities we learn about in historic research. Some people have described my looks as extremely friendly, gentle, and lovable. Others have, due to their preconceived ideas, thought of me as someone to be very cautious of. I always tried to bring laughter to people, never wishing harm to anybody, and never engaging in activities to hurt any single human being. In the eyes of my wife, I was unworthy to be believed in or considered as a human being. I could not believe how she could so easily forget my European Armenian background due to her being falsely informed by those who claimed to know the truth, whereas they were completely void of it, at the same time making her believe that Jehovah's Witnesses were the only trustworthy people. Almost all of them considered me as a second-class human, originating from a Muslim Middle Eastern country. If you experience what I did with the witness ministerial servants and elders talking about the blacks being scheduled to become white men in the new world of perfection, you can easily discover their racially motivated separatist attitude. Maybe they should take note of Jesus' words, "But I say unto you, that every idle word that man shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment." Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. However, they are well known to take part of one text from one of the scriptures and another from other parts to promote their ideas. Even my daughters did not accept me for who or what I was, due to their minds being influenced by their all-knowing friends and mother. But I do not need to accept what my daughters or their mother and friends popularly wanted to believe about my background. If they cannot accept me as I am, it is not a big deal or tragedy, for I will not change the reality. I am of a European Armenian origin and have lived partially in Turkey, but now I am proudly Australian. During my offspring's childhood, Australia was accepting migrants from Middle Eastern countries, including Turkey. The state and federal governments of Australia therefore provided funds for appropriate services to the community to develop and assist those migrants settle in Australia, find jobs, housing, and liaison between them and government authorities and health services. I was also happily involved in this service. In this role, I worked as a health and welfare liaison officer for the state government, apart from my tutoring duties. Through this occupation, I got to know many Turkish families, finding accommodation and helping them to find jobs, directing them to courses, which taught them language skills, as well as assisting their loved ones to unite with them through immigration. I was very friendly with them, and in return, they became very friendly with me. Occasionally, they invited me to their homes at weekends or on special celebrations to share their fun and barbecues, and my daughters had a marvelous time when I took them with me on those occasions. It was certainly educational. Nor can I ever forget the fun times we enjoyed at home on Sunday mornings with musical entertainment for children from the neighborhood, for it was all part of multicultural education and entertainment. All I wanted was to help my children and others accept all nationalities and cultures in this country. This was to lead them to accept people as they were, without discrimination. But some of those migrant friends did not need to know about my real background because of the unfortunate history they remembered, and my help could be nullified. There were a few rough rides ahead of me. Some Turks suspected that I might be Jewish, and worse still, being Armenian. Turks by nature resent Armenians in their country because of the historic events which they claim never happened. Although within Australia there was no need for any kind of discrimination and fierce opposition towards each other, for one hoped that both races were aiming at uniting as one in this vast country. Yet there were still people who hated others. Because I was assisting them caringly, they chose to oppose those who pointed a finger at me, and others accusing me of being an Armenian, as if being an Armenian was a crime, for they believed that I had to be a proper and genuine Turk with a Muslim background. According to gossip, some even thought that I was probably involved in spying activities. They all believed that Armenian dogs would never help a Muslim Turk in need. This may be why my daughters claimed that their father most certainly had to be a Muslim Turk, for he had many Turkish friends. He shared some of their activities, listened to their music, and spoke their language. Whatever has been supposedly explained to them by others who could only have been guessing, assuming, was not what I explained to my children and my once-upon-a-time wife about my origins. I do not think that their mother and friends helped them to know the real truth, as those people did not know anything about me. Is it not laughable that those who preached about the need not to judge anyone judged people like me amongst the many others without knowing a thing about them? There were also some who preferred to forget the help received altogether, and even exclaimed that they would be the very first ones to eradicate the Armenian dogs. Alas, there was great need to behave as one of them if one wanted to keep one's employment. This meant attending their celebrations, accepting their invitations, and listening to their music in some limited fashion, so that one could be regarded as one of them. This was the only way to get to know them better and assist them according to the rules laid down by the then government authority. Luckily, my musical interests have been very international. Unfortunately, in the eyes of my daughters, and particularly Birgit, as I have been informed many years later, I had to be a Turk because of my interest in things Turkish. Turks certainly have very colorful history and lifestyle, and their music and folklore can be equally fascinating. In other words, I admire Turkish history, music, and particularly cuisine. But I could not claim to be someone I was not. Yet my daughters were convinced I was what they have erroneously been told about me. This greatly saddened me. Although they had lived with me for a long while, they were incapable of understanding who I really was. In other words, under truly unrighteous and incorrect influence, they were adamant not to discover anything good about me. Maybe their attempt to surprise me by adding rat poison pellets in my coffee had something to do with it. I hoped I was wrong. However, I could not accept those claiming to know the truth, yet were full of lies and treachery. I found some comfort in the thought that my beloved daughters never had a chance to get to know me better. They never attempted to know anything about me, other than telling multiple untruths about my person, and those untruths became their integral wisdom. On the other hand, according to Birgit, who told me some years later, upon an accidental meeting, their mother would never tell lies, and she knew everything to be known about me. But did their mother know me at all? When Magda discovered my academic background, she could never accept it, interpreting my educational standpoint as an interest in psychic or occult science against God, without it being so. My practice of psychology was considered as the evil science of hypnosis, and nothing more. I dared not even try to explain anything, for fear of being understood completely against my personal principles. As I later discovered by listening to a number of witnesses, Magda believed I had to be of Muslim Turkish origin, never questioning anything and obviously forming her own opinions. Anybody from that background was expected to be very rough to their wives, giving them no freedom and treating them harshly. That allegedly could only be expected from somebody like me, as I was supposedly of that background. The Turks I have known were not like that, and that assumption was terribly erroneous. What they have been fed by a number of allegedly truth-loving witnesses was nothing short of lies. Magda never had the time or opportunity to get to know me, as she was always engrossed in her Bible studies. My life had become a huge boredom with her. Every time I tried to say something about Bible wisdom, or anything else during our last days together, she shouted at me words which were so stunning. "Get behind me, Satan! How dare you speak of God and God's holy word?" I was never given any chance to explain anything about myself and be understood. I am so happy to have recorded the occasion on tape, which never lies, for I wanted to keep a memory thereof without anticipating the kind of reaction I got. I believe that certain Jehovah's Witnesses took the situation as a great opportunity to further indoctrinate her against me, making her and our daughter Birgit believe that all witnesses were honest and truthful, whereas others like me, who were disfellowshipped, could only tell lies, just like their leader, Satan, the devil. They are well known for shunning others and doing everything possible to break families apart. It is a major part of their faith. Naturally, Magda, being their all-knowing mother, who never told lies, could successfully indoctrinate her daughters to believe that their father was a cheat and liar, apart from being a monster and charlatan. They were encouraged to choose Jehovah above all else and prove their loyalty by shunning the unfaithful. I only hope that she is happy with her achievements. I only hope that both her daughters are as she wanted them to be, great people, telling only the truth and living honest lives. After all the wonderful learning and study she has been subjected to, throughout the years it enabled her to describe me under a preconceived category. She probably known me better in her dreams than what I am in reality. Under direction from her beloved friends, she must have known that the girls would be led into the mom knows best syndrome. There is one simple action left for me, and that is to congratulate her on her great triumphs and successes. You are a great gem, Magda. Having arrived in Perth after those interesting experiences shared with George and Susan, and being shocked with a saltwater tea and coffee experience, we were now in the center of the city, where they also wondered where the actual city was. The very first words which came from George were, "This is the city which God had forsaken." However, it was easier for them to obtain emergency housing almost immediately somewhere in the surrounding suburbs. As a single person, I had to house myself and applied for a unit, or small house, through a group of real estate agents. On arrival, I quickly organized accommodation at one of the hotels on the outskirts of the city, which was well known to me. George and Susan were to sleep overnight in the hotel room without breakfast, and I was to sleep in the car for that night, although they insisted that I could sleep in a corner within the temporary accommodation. Being a very private person, I chose the car, and believe they appreciated this sacrifice on my part. The next morning, after breakfast in the city, we went to the Department of Housing. A few necessary details considered, several official forms completed and signed with my assistance, we were given a couple of addresses to visit. A bus trip ensued, which took a considerable time. We finally arrived at the suburb of Coolballup and were strictly advised to be very cautious when pronouncing this name in front of Aborigines, for it would be very offensive to them. After seeing the housing estate employees in their office, and having inspected the property, which contained some basic furniture, George and Susan were very excited and happy to rent the house. They suggested that we could do some shopping locally and that I could stay at their new accommodation that night, or until I was housed. Since it was a weekend, I gratefully accepted their offer, but I was desperately in need to accommodate myself elsewhere and start doing my own thing. Besides, they needed their privacy. They insisted that I should stay there as long as I wanted, for they trusted me completely, but I took the challenge of traveling the long distance on the bus into the city, visiting real estate agents and having many cups of coffee at the Carillon. Some of the coffee lounges and restaurants I used to frequent have now sunk into the sandy ground after all these years. The whole city seems to have been built upon sand, and interestingly, the lower parts of almost all buildings and trees looked as if they were salt or iron oxide affected and colored orange-brown. Perth looked inviting and beautiful, although it had some very unusual aspects. I can never forget how a short indigenous man stood in front of me out of the blue while I was heading towards the Carillon, leaning on me as if wanting to kiss me, his face very close to mine, making me worried. I interpreted it as an insult to my person in a very native Australian way, which I was unfamiliar with. I could be really angry with him and be accused of being racist or give him a shock that he would never forget. Since I could not accept insult from anybody, I decided to give him a brotherly hug, during which he could not breathe. I told him he was my brother, and it was time to shock him, and amused several spectators. He smelled like beer and was begging if I could help him with some money, or panting due to shortness of breath he had just experienced. I told him that I had only recently arrived, but could probably help him later, if we met again. He reluctantly accepted that, and said, "You are a different fella. All of them fellas don't like us very much here." There was certainly a lot more to learn. It was going to be a very healthy move when I settled, probably close to the city, but what was I going to occupy myself with? Several interviews later, I moved into a beautiful and luxurious unit in Victoria Park, on a top floor facing the city. Shopping centres, dentists, and doctors were nearby. It was very reasonably priced and, in a sense, one of the upper-class areas of Perth. I visited George and Susan from time to time, while I got all my belongings and bedding, which were stored in Melbourne, which greatly helped me settle in Perth. But my only companion, my cat Blinky, was still the greatest joy when she arrived from Victoria. Almost every second day, Reg called me on the telephone, telling me all the news from there. Perth looked very promising, but I was told that in the middle of summer it was not so perfect. The grass had no chance to mature or remain green. The council gardeners usually had beach sand all over it, supposedly to protect it against the harsh sun. In actuality, the salt content destroyed it. I was told that rolls of green lawn grass were shipped from Victoria, but they did not last long, and many people preferred artificial grass, for it never needed any maintenance or watering, and remained green all year round. I am certain that things have changed since then, and the city became more beautiful. However, one could not help but notice how lush and healthy the grass in supporting areas was. The same could be seen in privately owned backyards, where people were growing a large variety of roses. There were numerous marketplaces resembling yesteryear's Wild West, filled with extreme kitsch and a multitude of eateries, colorful clothing material, as well as most eccentric people. Many West Australians generally created an impression of having an easygoing lifestyle. Perth and surrounding suburbs were populated by either the very rich or the poorest of people. One could find almost everything from the latest fashion to many kinds of electronic goods. They were things one is accustomed to in the eastern states, and peculiarly, the public unusually tended to look down on people originating from the east. In fact, I was often preached about how beautiful the weather was in the West, where people disliked the others from the eastern states, until of course one bravely declared why he or she preferred to stay in this magnificent part of Australia. Interestingly, I was told by born and bred West Australians that living there could be very boring, lacking variety, yet a number of great thinkers, scientists, and the very rich dwelt in this part of Australia. There were many elite people, and also pretenders, like anywhere else within this vast land. I also met many native Australians. For some strange reason, we were warned by the local authority to be very discerning with the natives, as they sometimes entered into people's private properties, claiming that the land was theirs, and therefore they could enter into any dwelling or anywhere as if everything belonged to them. Personally, I never experienced anything like that, in spite of encountering a large number of native folk. There were people begging, even demanding money, but many others were extremely friendly. I fail to understand why they were portrayed as doing undesirable things. According to information, some Europeans chose to marry Aboriginal ladies, but it was not my interest to marry again. However, I wanted to get to know them better and discover a little more about their rich history and traditions. Several people chose only to complain about them, especially in regard to the West Australian government, generously providing housing to their families only to have those properties destroyed, since they traditionally started a fire in the middle of the rooms and sometimes burned the place down, while also hurting themselves in the process. I was not sure about that, for I never encountered such destructive natives, while considering that destructive people could be found everywhere around the world. What I discovered was that those living in the neighborhood were well-behaved and always full of smiles. I suppose whatever we look for, we can always find, be it nice or nasty, good or violent, beautiful or ugly. I prefer to see the good in all things and in all people without any discrimination. My friends in Coolbellup soon met Turks living in other suburbs of Perth and introduced me to them. Although I got myself a great unit in Victoria Park, I felt the need to do something creative and applied for a tutoring position at one of the universities and came across an opportunity to start broadcasting for the local community as well as in a few foreign languages such as German and Turkish. Using this opportunity, I introduced a drive-time music program featuring listeners' requests. It was going to be once a week and involved several hours of studio work. In the meantime, some of my Turkish friends asked me to present regular Turkish language programs over the radio, the material for which was to be partially provided by Turkish radio and television in Ankara. Furthermore, their former Perth radio presenter had resigned. I accepted the challenge and started a few special programs, some of which I prepared at home, using my own professional recording equipment. One such program was about the history of music, particularly about the times of the Hittites and the great Ottoman Empire through the ages and its evolvement into modern days. Being non-religious, I preferred to present more folkloric and current styles of music, as well as the daily news, some current affairs, and sporting news. I even suggested creating a link with people's loved ones in their homeland, so that they could talk to each other over the radio. Before I started some of the Turkish programs, I was introduced as their new radio host by one of their club presidents, and there was much excitement in the air. Several months later, during one of their fundraising functions, I was told that even during their important celebrations, and particularly during their month of Ramadan, I had not presented them with anything religious, and there were no Quran-based prayer sessions. Unfortunately, they had not provided me with the appropriate audio material to broadcast, and I was unable to present anything like that other than rely on my own library. If they had the initiative to include one of their religious men of God, I could have included him, and everybody would be happy. I was only told to present their program in their tongue and utilize their music, and that was all I could do in the circumstances. I was praised as a very clear, systematic, and direct-to-the-point presenter. However, religious programming was very important to them. Therefore, I recommended that they should bring back their previous presenter instead of me. And although reluctant at first, they nevertheless accepted it. Now I could concentrate on hosting the programs I truly enjoyed. It was far better for me to remain neutral in regard to people's beliefs and religion.